For 17 years, nobody saw her at the back of the church. Until an old hymn book revealed her secret. For 17 years, Aroha Jenkins sat in the very last pew of St. Mary's Anglican Church in Dunedin, invisible to everyone, even to God, it seemed. She would slip in just as the opening hymn began, her weathered hands clutching a small, worn handbag, and slip out before the final blessing, like a shadow that had never been there at all. The congregation knew her face, but not her name. They saw her grey wool cardigan, her silver hair pinned back in the same modest bun, but they never saw her heart. Aroha was 63 years old, and she had been carrying a weight that no one could see. She lived alone in a small cottage on Crawford Street, where the morning mist would roll in from the harbour and settle on her garden of forget-me-nots and lavender. Her days were quiet, achingly quiet. She would tend to her roses, brew tea in her grandmother's china pot, and listen to the radio while darning old socks that no one would ever wear. But Sunday mornings were different. Every week, she would walk the same path to St. Mary's, her footsteps echoing softly on the stone steps. She would choose the last pew on the left, always the same spot, as if she were hiding from something. Or someone. The other parishioners would nod politely if they caught her eye, but most of the time, they didn't even notice she was there. Mrs. Henderson, who sat 3 rows ahead, would sometimes glance back during the piece, but Aroha would already be looking down at her hands. The Reverend David Morrison had tried to approach her once or twice after service, but she would smile briefly and disappear through the side door before he could say more than good morning. What no one knew, what no one could have imagined, was that Aroha Jenkins had not always been invisible. 17 years ago, she had been the church organist. Her fingers had danced across the keys every Sunday, filling the sanctuary with music that made even the stoniest hearts soften. The congregation would turn to watch her play, their faces lighting up as she brought each hymn to life with a grace that seemed to come from somewhere beyond this world. But then, something happened. It was a cold Sunday in August, 1998. The morning service had just begun, and Aroha was preparing to play the opening hymn, How Great Thou Art, when she noticed something that made her blood turn to ice. In the front pew, sitting beside her husband of 26 years, was a woman she didn't recognize. A woman with auburn hair and a soft smile, a woman whose hand was resting gently on her husband's arm. Aroha's fingers froze above the keys. The congregation waited in expectant silence, but no music came. She could feel their eyes on her, could hear the uncomfortable shifting in the pews, but all she could see was that woman's hand on her husband's arm. That was the last time Aroha Jenkins played the organ at St. Mary's. Within a week, her husband had moved out of their home on Crawford Street. Within a month, the divorce papers had been signed. And within a year, the woman with the auburn hair had become the new Mrs. Jenkins. But Aroha had simply vanished. She stopped answering her phone. She stopped going to the shops during the day. She stopped tending to her garden, and the roses grew wild and untamed. The only time anyone saw her was on Sunday mornings, when she would slip into the back pew like a ghost returning to haunt the place where her life had ended. The new organist, a young man named Timothy, with eager eyes and clumsy fingers, would stumble through the hymns each week, missing notes and losing tempo. The congregation would sing along politely, but everyone knew, everyone remembered how it used to sound when Aroha played. But Aroha never offered to help. She never stepped forward. She just sat in her pew, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the stained glass window that depicted Jesus calling to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. Years passed. The seasons changed. The congregation aged, and new faces appeared while familiar ones disappeared. Children grew up and moved away. Elderly members passed on to their eternal rest. But Aroha remained constant as the mountains that surrounded Dunedin, silent as the morning mist that rolled in from the harbour. She had learned to live with the silence. She had learned to carry her pain like a stone in her chest, heavy but familiar. She had learned to be invisible, because being seen meant being vulnerable, and being vulnerable meant being hurt again. But sometimes late at night, when the house was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat, Aroha would sit at her old piano and place her fingers on the keys. She wouldn't press them down, she wouldn't make a sound. But she would remember the feeling of music flowing through her hands, the feeling of being connected to something beautiful and eternal. She would remember who she used to be. One Sunday morning in late spring, as the daffodils were beginning to bloom in the churchyard, something unusual happened. Reverend Morrison had fallen ill with a nasty bout of flu, and the guest preacher, a young woman named Sarah from the seminary in Christchurch, was struggling to find her rhythm with the congregation. During the service, as Timothy was playing the final hymn, his fingers stumbled badly on a complex passage in Be Thou My Vision. The music faltered, then stopped altogether. The congregation fell silent, unsure whether to continue singing or wait for the music to resume. It was then that young Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Perhaps, she said gently from the pulpit, her voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary, perhaps someone else might help us finish this beautiful hymn. Music is one of God's greatest gifts, and sometimes the gift finds its way back to us when we need it most. The congregation shifted uncomfortably. Timothy looked embarrassed, his face flushed red, as he stared at the keys. Mrs. Henderson glanced around the church, as if hoping someone would step forward. And in the back pew, Aroha felt something stir in her chest. Something she hadn't felt in 17 years. It wasn't courage, not exactly. It was something quieter than that. Something that felt like recognition. Slowly, as if moving through water, Aroha stood up. The congregation turned to look at her, their faces filled with curiosity and surprise. She had been invisible for so long that some of them had forgotten she was even there. She walked down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Past Mrs. Henderson, who watched with wide eyes. Past the middle pews where young families sat with their children. Past the front pew where he used to sit with his new wife. When she reached the organ, Timothy looked up at her with relief and gratitude. He slid over on the bench, making room for her to sit beside him. Aroha placed her hands on the keys, and for a moment, she just sat there, feeling the familiar weight of them beneath her fingers. The keys were warm from Timothy's playing, and they felt like old friends welcoming her home. She began to play, softly at first, then with growing confidence. The notes filled the sanctuary like sunlight breaking through clouds, and the congregation drew in a collective breath. This was the music they remembered, this was the sound that had been missing from their worship for 17 years. As she played, Aroha felt something she hadn't felt since that terrible Sunday in 1998. She felt present. She felt seen. Not invisible, not hidden, but truly, genuinely seen. The congregation began to sing along, their voices rising with the music. Even those who usually only mumbled through the hymns found themselves singing with full hearts, carried along by the beauty of what they were hearing. And in that moment, something shifted. After the service ended, as people were filing out of the church, several parishioners approached Aroha. Mrs. Henderson was the first, her eyes bright with tears. "Aroha, dear," she said, taking her hand gently. "We've missed you so much. We've missed your music, but more than that, we've missed you." Others gathered around her, faces she recognized from years of sitting in the back pew, people she had watched from a distance, but never spoken to. They told her how much her playing had meant to them, how much they had hoped she would come back to the organ bench. "We never knew why you stopped," said Mrs. Crawford, an elderly woman whose husband had passed away the previous winter. "But we always hoped you would return to us." Young Sarah, the guest preacher, was the last to approach. She was holding something in her hands, an old, leather-bound hymnal with worn edges and faded gold lettering. "I found this tucked behind the organ," she said, offering it to Aroha. "It has your name written inside the front cover, and there are notes in the margins, in your handwriting. I think it's been waiting for you." Aroha took the hymnal with trembling hands. She opened the front cover and saw her own name, written in the careful script of a much younger woman, Aroha Jenkins, church organist, 1975 to 1998. But it was what she saw next that took her breath away. Tucked between the pages of Be Thou My Vision, the very hymn she had just played, was a small piece of paper. A note, written in handwriting she didn't recognize. She unfolded it carefully, her heart pounding. The note was short, written in the careful script of a child. "Dear Mrs. Jenkins, my name is Emma, and I was 8 years old when you stopped playing the organ. I want you to know that your music was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. Every Sunday, I would sit in the third pew with my mum and dad, and I would close my eyes and pretend I was flying when you played. When you stopped playing, I cried for weeks. My mum said you were probably just taking a break, but I knew something was wrong. I wanted to write you a letter then, but I didn't know how to find you. I am 25 now, and I live in Auckland. I am getting married next month, and I wanted you to know that I've asked my husband to be, if we could have our wedding at St. Mary's, because I still remember how your music made me feel like I could fly. I hope someday you'll play again. The church isn't the same without your music, and neither am I. With love and gratitude, Emma Morrison. P.S. Reverend Morrison is my uncle. I've asked him to make sure you get this note, even if it takes years." Aroha's hands were shaking as she finished reading. She looked up at young Sarah, tears streaming down her cheeks. When was this written?" she whispered. "The date at the bottom says 2010, Sarah replied gently. "It's been waiting here for 5 years, waiting for the right moment." Aroha felt something break open in her chest, something that had been locked away for 17 years. It wasn't just grief or pain, it was something bigger than that. Something that felt like forgiveness. Not just for others, but for herself. She had spent 17 years believing that she was invisible, that her absence didn't matter. But Emma's letter proved that someone had seen her. Someone had noticed when she disappeared. Someone had been waiting for her to come back. Would you? Aroha's voice was barely above a whisper. Would you mind if I played one more hymn? Sarah smiled, her own eyes bright with tears. I think the congregation would love that. Word spread quickly through the church that Aroha was going to play again. People who had already left came back inside. Others called their friends and neighbors on their mobile phones. Within 10 minutes, the sanctuary was fuller than it had been during the regular service. Aroha sat at the organ bench, her fingers poised over the keys. She thought about Emma's letter, about the little girl who had sat in the third pew and felt like she was flying. She thought about all the years of silence, all the years of hiding in the back pew. She thought about the weight she had been carrying, and she decided, finally, to put it down. She began to play Amazing Grace slowly, tenderly, with all the skill and feeling that had been dormant for 17 years. The music filled the sanctuary like a prayer made audible, like hope given voice. As she played, Aroha felt something she hadn't felt since that terrible Sunday in 1998. She felt forgiven. Not by others, but by herself. She felt worthy of taking up space in the world again. She felt worthy of being seen. The congregation sang along, their voices joining together in a harmony that seemed to rise straight up to heaven. And for the first time in 17 years, Aroha Jenkins felt like she was home. After the music ended, there was a long moment of sacred silence. Then, slowly, the congregation began to applaud, not the polite applause of a formal concert, but the heartfelt applause of people who had witnessed something miraculous. Aroha stood up from the organ bench, her legs unsteady but her heart full. She looked out at the faces of the congregation, faces that had watched her disappear 17 years ago, faces that had welcomed her back without question or judgment. And in that moment, she realized something profound. She had never actually been invisible. She had been seen all along by Emma, by Mrs. Henderson, by the Reverend, by countless others who had simply been waiting for her to see herself again. As she walked back down the aisle, no longer hiding, no longer invisible, Aroha felt lighter than she had in years. The weight she had been carrying was still there, but it no longer defined her. She was more than her pain. She was more than what had been done to her. She was Aroha Jenkins, and she had music to share with the world. Outside the church, as the spring sunshine warmed her face and the scent of daffodils filled the air, Aroha opened Emma's letter one more time. At the very bottom, in a small postscript she had missed before, were these words. P.S. I still close my eyes and pretend I'm flying when I hear beautiful music. Thank you for teaching me that some things are worth waiting for. Aroha smiled, really smiled, for the first time in 17 years. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her handbag, next to her grandmother's prayer book and a small packet of forget-me-not seeds. Then she began the walk home to Crawford Street, no longer invisible, no longer hiding, no longer afraid of being seen. Behind her, the bells of St. Mary's began to ring, calling the faithful to worship, calling the lost to come home, calling the invisible to step into the light. Have you ever chosen silence and found strength in it?